I woke up to the sound of laughter, only to find my life's memories sprawled across the front yard, my clothes being sold like junk. My son smiled, his words cold. We need space. But as they sat down to breakfast, I made my move. While they chewed on their eggs, I sold everything they thought was mine. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, the warm Texas sun already creeping into the edges of the room. She hadn't been awake for long, just enough time to feel the unfamiliar quietness that usually marked her morning. But today, there was a strange hum in the air, something off-key. She frowned, shifting in bed, and listened. The low murmur of voices outside her window pulled her fully awake. Her pulse quickened as she swung her feet over the side of the bed, the hardwood cool against her bare skin. What was happening? She strained to hear, but it was no use. The murmuring grew louder, and now there was a faint clinking of metal. And then a loud burst of laughter, Caleb's voice unmistakable. What in the world? Eleanor muttered to herself, her heart pounding in her. She pushed herself up, pulling on the robe that hung over her chair. The house felt strange in the early morning light, as if it had been invaded while she slept. Though no one had actually stepped inside, she shuffled slowly to the window and peeked through the blinds. The front yard was a spectacle, a jumble of tables, some old, some newer, some with frayed edges, lined the sidewalk. But what truly stunned Eleanor were the piles of clothes strewn across those tables: dresses, jackets, old cardigans, her clothes, her life's work. The delicate fabrics she'd sewn with care, now displayed like secondhand junk. She saw Heather, standing by a table, eagerly haggling with a neighbor over the price of a floral blouse Eleanor had loved, back when she was still young and foolish enough to wear such bright things. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Caleb's voice echoed through the yard. We're decluttering the old stuff. It's gotta go. Make space for the new. He laughed again, the sound light and careless. She couldn't breathe for a moment, the shock of it rendering her. They're selling my things. The words didn't seem real, but there they were. Her things, her memories, strewn across a yard sale table, just another pile of old things to be rid of. With shaking hands, she pressed the palm of her hand to the window, steadying herself. Is this really happening? She whispered to herself. Just then she heard a familiar voice, low and muffled through the wall. It was Donna, Eleanor's neighbor. Always a few steps ahead and always watching. She pushed open the window just enough to hear her clearly. They didn't even ask you? Donna's voice was quiet, tinged with disbelief. She was standing near the fence, arms crossed, her graying hair pulled into a tight bun. Eleanor could see her eyes flicker with concern, though she held herself with that sharp, no-nonsense edge that had made her both a confidant and a gossip queen in their name. Eleanor swallowed hard to find her voice. No, no, they didn't. Donna's response was a slow shake of her head, eyes hardening in quiet anger. Eleanor could almost hear the unspoken judgment in. They've gone too far, Donna murmured. Eleanor leaned against the windowsill, pressing her face to the cool glass. She wanted to scream, to run out there and grab her clothes off those tables, but something held her back. The weight of it all was too much. The humiliation sank deep, mixing with a strange, simmering rage she hadn't quite expected. How could they do this to me? She thought of her sewing machine, the countless hours spent in this very room, stitching together something meaningful, something that had never been about clutter or mess, but rather love and care for a home, for a life that she had built with her own hands. And now, it was being picked over by strangers as if it meant nothing. The muffled laughter from the yard grew louder, more insistent. Heather was still bargaining over the price of the blouse. Caleb, just a few feet away, was directing the chaos, treating it like a game. If it doesn't sell today, it goes to the donation pile, he yelled, as if it were all so simple. Eleanor's chest tightened with the weight of it. She finally tore her gaze away from the window, taking a few slow steps backward into the dimness of her room. The silence in the house felt like it was closing in, oppressive in its stillness. Her eyes flickered to the notebook she kept on the nightstand. The pages were blank, waiting. It was time to make a decision. Time to put her thoughts into action. Eleanor reached for the notebook, steadying her shaking hands as she flipped it open. The pencil in her hand hovered for a moment, the tip of it just above the paper. She let out a breath, slow and deliberate, and then began writing. I will not be ignored. I will not be erased. As the first words formed on the page, Eleanor's eyes caught a glimmer of something outside. A flash of light from the porch, the reflection of sunlight glancing off metal. A moving truck had pulled. Her heart skipped. It was beginning. Eleanor stood frozen, her eyes still locked on the moving truck that had appeared like an omen in her front yard. For a moment, her mind raced, unsure of what to do next. The weight of everything felt too much to carry. Her belongings, her dignity, her home, all slipping away while she stood in a quiet room, helpless. The truck's engine hummed louder, the sound somehow dragging her further into this surreal nightmare. She knew she needed to act, quickly, but her body refused to respond. It wasn't the physical exhaustion that held her in place, but the crushing humiliation of it. The realization that her son and his wife had orchestrated this entire event, as if her life's treasures were nothing more than clutter, left her breathless. The air in the room grew thick as she turned slowly, her mind slowly coming back to focus. She pulled her robe tighter, but it didn't make her feel any more secure. She needed to see it, to confront it, to face what they had done. The soft scrape of a chair leg caught her attention. Ruby stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. Eleanor hadn't noticed her standing there, but now that she saw her, the guilt hit her like a wave. Ruby's brown eyes were filled with concern, but there was something else too. Something Eleanor had not seen before. Fear. Ruby didn't want to be here. Grandma, Ruby whispered, voice thick with regret. I tried to stop them. Eleanor swallowed, her gaze softening as she looked at her granddaughter. She tried. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it meant everything. She didn't speak immediately, just nodded slightly, though the lump in her throat threatened to choke her. The silence between them grew thick with unspoken words. But before Eleanor could offer any comfort or even a response, the sound of Caleb's voice broke through. Mom, he shouted from the yard, too chipper, too casual. We're making room for the new stuff. You never wear these anymore. We need space. Eleanor's pulse surged, a hot wave of anger flaring in her. You never wear them. The words stung in a way she wasn't prepared for. Each piece of clothing on those tables, the ones she had poured time, love, and years of work into, meant something. Each stitch, each fabric had a memory. But to Caleb, they were just things that no longer fit his idea of what her life should look like. She clutched the windowsill, forcing herself to stay still. She could feel her blood boiling, but she wasn't going to let him see her break. Not now. Not like this. Ruby took a tentative step toward her. Grandma, what are you going to do? The question trembled in the air, and Eleanor could see the worry in Ruby's eyes, her hands wringing together. Eleanor met her gaze, the raw emotion pooling in her chest. She wasn't sure what the answer was yet. She didn't know what she could do. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw Donna standing near the fence, watching. It was like the sharp edge of a knife, cutting through the fog of confusion in her mind. Donna wasn't just an onlooker. She had been watching. Always watching. With a quick glance, Eleanor caught Donna's eye, and her neighbor gave a slow, deliberate nod. Almost imperceptible, but the message was clear. Document everything. It was as if Donna was handing her the one thing she could control in a situation that felt so out of her hand. The idea settled on Eleanor like a weight. But it wasn't a burden. It was clarity. She could fight back in small ways. She could make them see. Ruby, Eleanor said quietly, her voice firm with resolve. Go to the kitchen. Get me that old notebook I keep by the window, the one with the pen. Ruby hesitated but nodded and disappeared into the next room, her footsteps retreating quickly as Eleanor returned her focus to the yard. She was aware now of the full weight of what was happening. They had crossed a line. The rustling from the yard, Heather's voice, A low, cutting laugh, Caleb directing the movers like a general, echoed in her mind. It was too much. She had to start taking control of this. To prove that this wasn't just about the clothes, the house, or even her. It was about dignity. And they had robbed her of it. Ruby returned with the notebook, handing it to her cautiously. Eleanor took it, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped it open, the pages empty, waiting. The blank space stared back at her, waiting for her to fill it, to etch her thoughts into the paper, into the world. I will not be ignored. She wrote the words slowly, deliberately, letting the pressure in her chest release with each stroke of the pencil. I will not be erased. The words felt like armor, like a declaration, something solid she could hold on to. It was the only thing left in her. She wasn't sure what would happen next, or how this would play out, but this was something she could do. Something real. The weight of her decision settled over her like a cloak of purpose. She closed the notebook with a soft, final click. And then, from the yard, she heard Caleb again, his voice rising in that same irritatingly light tone. Mom, you've got to let go. It's just stuff. It's not worth getting upset over. Eleanor's jaw clenched, her fists tightening around the notebook. She took a breath, steadying herself, and turned toward Ruby. It's worth everything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with a quiet storm. And then, she headed for the door. This wasn't over. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, her hands clenched around the notebook she had just written in. The air outside, thick with the buzz of the yard sale chaos, seemed to press against her skin. She stood tall, unwilling to show any weakness, her back straight and her eyes fixed on the driveway. Caleb and Heather were still overseeing the absurd spectacle of her belongings being sold off, but their voices were distant now, like a cacophony just out of reach. She didn't need to hear them. She already knew what they were saying. Turning away from the sight, Eleanor walked back into the house, the silence of the living room swallowing her whole. Her hand went instinctively to the desk drawer where she kept the deed to the house. She slid it out carefully, her fingers brushing over the familiar yellowed paper. For a moment, the weight of it was enough to ground her. This house had been a gift from her late husband, a place they had built together, where they had raised Caleb, where she had sewn her life's work into every stitch. And now, it felt like everything was slipping through. She pulled the deed from the envelope, laying it flat on the kitchen. Clear ownership. The words jumped out at her from the bold text, their meaning suddenly bearing more weight than ever. This house, this space, belonged to her. Not Caleb, not Heather. It was hers, and it always had been. She let out a slow breath, the relief of knowing she still had something, even as everything else was slipping away, hitting her with a new wave of strength. I'm not done yet. Footsteps approached from behind, and Eleanor's heart sank a little as she recognized the sound of Ruby's soft steps on the floor. She hadn't meant to snap out of her reverie so quickly, but Ruby was always there, a quiet observer of the storm. Grandma. Ruby's voice was soft, almost hesitant. I heard them talking. Eleanor's heart skipped in her chest. They said. Ruby paused, glancing nervously toward the window, her voice lowering further. They said they're going to push you into assisted living. The words felt like a punch to Eleanor's gut, a jagged twist of cruelty in the middle of the already painful morning. Push her out of her own life, out of her own home, like I'm nothing more than a burden. She didn't say anything at first, just stared down at the deed in front of her, feeling her fingers tighten around the edge. The room was cold, though the sun beat through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. Why didn't they just ask? Ruby whispered, a tinge of anger in her voice, but Eleanor could only offer a strained smile. Ruby's anger, her concern, were all too real, but there was nothing they could do about it. Not yet. Don't worry, Ruby, Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. She had to keep control of herself, of this situation. She needed to think clearly, not just react out of hurt. Ruby didn't look convinced. I don't like how they're treating you. It's not right. She was still standing in the doorway, her arms crossed in the same way Eleanor had seen her mother stand when she was about to make a. It was both comforting and heartbreaking, seeing Ruby try to be strong when all she wanted was to protect her grandmother. I know, sweetheart, Eleanor said softly. I know. Her mind was already racing through the possibility, thinking through what she could do next. She couldn't just sit here and take it. She wasn't weak. And if Caleb and Heather thought she'd just sit back and let them take everything from her, they were wrong. Eleanor reached for her phone, her hands no longer shaking. The room felt smaller as she scrolled through her contact, eyes landing on the name she needed, Martin Hale, the real estate attorney. She had worked with him a few years ago when she'd filed some paperwork. He was sharp, professional, but more importantly, he was on her side. He knew the law, and that was something she was about to need more than anything else. Her finger hovered over his number for a moment. She could already hear his calm voice in her mind. You've got this, Eleanor. With a deep breath, she pressed dial. The phone rang twice before he answered. Martin Hale. His voice was clipped, familiar. It's Eleanor Briggs, she said, her voice steady, purposeful. I need your help. There was a pause, the sound of papers shifting on his. Of course, Eleanor. What's going on? I'm selling my house, she said, her words flat and to the point. She heard him exhale softly, as if considering something. Well, that's straightforward enough. What's the situation? Eleanor's fingers tightened around the phone. She could feel the edge in her own voice, but there was no turning back now. My son and his wife are trying to take it from me. They're trying to force me out of my own home. I need to make sure that can't happen. Martin's voice softened. I'll handle it, Eleanor. We'll take care of it. Don't worry. She closed her eyes for a moment, grateful for his professionalism, for his assurance. Thank you, she whispered. As the call ended, Eleanor stood by the table, staring down at the deed in front of her. Her pulse thrummed in her, the weight of her decision settling over her. She was doing this. She was fighting back. The house wasn't just walls and windows. It was her sanctuary, her fortress. And if they thought they could take that from her, they were in for a lesson. She wasn't done yet. And they were going to learn that the hard way. Eleanor stood in the living room, staring out the window, her fingers still lightly brushing the edges of the deed in her hand. The house, once full of life and love, now felt like an anchor around her ankles, holding her in place while the world outside moved on without her. Her pulse was still racing from the call to Martin Hale, but a new kind of resolve was settling in her chest. This house, this sanctuary, wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of everything she had built, everything she had fought for, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it. As if to prove that point, she heard Caleb's voice outside, louder now, more insistent. Mom, it's time to downsize. You can't stay here forever. Caleb called from the yard, his tone filled with the kind of casual dismissal that had always grated on Eleanor's nerves. She could picture him standing there, hands on his, as if it were all so simple, as if her life could be boiled down to a few boxes of clothes and a list of to-dos that he and Heather would check off without a second thought. Inside, Heather's voice joined. This house is wasted space, she said, as if Eleanor's home were nothing more than a useless relic of a time that had passed. Eleanor's breath hitched, but she didn't move. She wouldn't let them see how deeply their words cut. The house was not wasted space. It was the place where she had lived, laughed, and loved. It was the home she had fought for when everything else seemed out of reach. She could hear them out there, their voices merging into one, like an unrelenting tide pushing against her. But she wasn't going to be swept away by it. In the silence that followed, she walked toward the fireplace. It was an old habit, something that had always comforted her. The soft crackle of firewood burning, the warmth that would spread through the room. She had never used it much since Harry passed, but now it felt like a fitting place for what she needed to do. She reached for the brochure that had been sitting on the coffee table, the one Caleb had brought home a few days ago, mocking her with its glossy pictures of ideal living spaces for the elderly. A place for you to enjoy your golden years, it had said in bold, cheerful letters. The brochure was an insult, a reminder of the trap Caleb and Heather wanted to put her in. She had no intention of going to any of those places. With a steady hand, She held the brochure to the flame and watched it catch fire. The paper curled and blackened as the flames consumed it, the heat rising in a sharp contrast to the chill she felt inside. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. The paper crackled as it burned, turning to ash. It felt like a small victory, like the first real step she was taking in reclaiming control of her life. Behind her, Ruby appeared, standing silently in the doorway, watching her grandmother with wide eyes. "Grandma," Ruby whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "What are you going to do now?" Eleanor turned slowly, her gaze softening as she met her granddaughter's eyes. She could see the uncertainty there, the concern that still lingered in Ruby's gaze. But there was something else too. Something that reminded her of herself at Ruby's age. A spark of hope, of belief, that maybe, just maybe, this could be different. Eleanor smiled faintly, the firelight reflecting off the tear that escaped down her cheek. "I'm going to sell something bigger," she said, her voice quiet but steady. She wasn't sure how she was going to do it yet, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going down without a fight. Ruby's eyes widened in surprise, but Eleanor could see the flicker of understanding in her expression. Ruby had always been sharp, always had a way of reading between the lines, of understanding things before they were fully explained. "You're going to sell the house?" Ruby asked cautiously, her voice still thick with disbelief. Eleanor nodded. "Not to them, but to someone who will truly appreciate it." The words tasted like freedom on her tongue. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about regaining something she had almost lost: her dignity, her autonomy, her ability to decide what came next. Just as Ruby opened her mouth to speak again, Eleanor turned back to the fireplace. The flames had burned through the last of the brochure, leaving only a handful of charred remnants behind. Eleanor looked down at the ashes, feeling a sudden wave of clarity wash over her. "You know, Donna was right," she said, her voice low, almost to her. She could see Donna's face in her mind, that smirk of hers as she'd watched Eleanor stand strong. "It's time to start playing the game on my terms." From outside, Caleb's voice came again, insistent, grating. "Mom, what's the holdup? We've got plans." Eleanor turned her head, facing the door. The burn of the fire still lingered in her nostrils. She straightened her shoulders, her eyes glinting with quiet resolve. They had no idea what was coming next. She stepped away from the fireplace, her heart pounding with purpose. "Now we're cooking," she muttered under her breath, a smile pulling at the corners of her lips. And just as the last embers died in the fireplace, Eleanor Briggs took her first step toward revenge. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the kitchen table. Eleanor sat at the table, the deed to her house spread out before her like a declaration of independence. Her fingers traced the familiar lines of the document, the bold text confirming what she already knew. The house was hers, completely and utterly hers. No mortgage, no liens. It was a piece of her past, her present, and her future. She could still hear Caleb's voice outside, still pushing, still trying to strip her of everything she had worked for, but the sting of it no longer burned. No, it only fueled her. She was no longer the woman they thought they knew. The phone on the counter buzzed, and Eleanor's heart leapt in her. She snatched it up quickly, her hands steady as she read the message from Martin Hale. "I've confirmed everything. Ready to go. I'll draft the contract and send it over." Eleanor let out a slow breath, the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't giving in. The thought of what was about to happen, a simple signature, one stroke of the pen, and everything would change. The power was shifting, and Eleanor was ready to take. Just as she was about to dial Martin's number, Ruby appeared in the doorway, her eyes still wide with the uncertainty of the past few days. But there was something different now, something deeper in her gaze, something that said Ruby had begun to understand. "Grandma, are you sure about this?" Ruby asked, her voice soft, almost afraid. "I mean, Dad doesn't even know what you're doing." Eleanor paused for a moment, letting Ruby's words sink. "He doesn't need to know yet," she said, her voice calm as if every word was a quiet affirmation. "He'll find out when it's time, not before breakfast." Ruby's lips parted, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she might ask more questions, but Ruby simply nodded, biting her lip. It wasn't easy for her, Eleanor could see that. But Ruby was strong, and in her own way she was choosing to stand with Eleanor. "Okay," Ruby whispered, turning to leave, but not before pausing to glance back. "Just be careful, Grandma." Eleanor smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "I've always been careful, darling," she said, her voice steady with years of experience. "This is the right thing to." As Ruby's footsteps receded down the hall, Eleanor picked up the phone, her fingers trembling only slightly as she dialed Martin's number. The phone rang once, twice, before Martin's calm voice greeted her. "Eleanor, good to hear from you. We're all set on this end. I've got the contract ready." Eleanor's heart beat faster as she listened to Martin's confident voice. She felt herself leaning into the moment, realizing that everything she had done, every choice, every decision, had led her here. "Great," she said, her voice unwavering. "Let's get it done." "I'll send the paperwork over in a few minutes," Martin continued. "Once you sign, we'll be good to go." The contract would go through, and the sale would be final. She didn't need to ask questions. She didn't need to second-guess herself. She trusted Martin. He had always been straightforward with her. The buyer was lined up. A community housing nonprofit. The kind of place where people could rebuild their lives. A place where the house would serve a purpose far greater than just a property to be sold off for a profit. She wasn't just getting rid of a house, she was turning it into something that mattered. Something they could never take from her. After the call ended, Eleanor set the phone down slowly, taking a deep breath. She looked around the kitchen, the room where she had made countless meals for her family, where she had spent so many quiet moments, and now she was signing away the house, but not in victory. A knock at the door startled her, and she turned to see Donna standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, that knowing look in her eyes. "You're going through with it, huh?" Donna said, her voice low, like she was speaking to an old friend. Eleanor nodded, her resolve steady. "It's time." Donna gave a sly grin, her eyes twinkling. "They won't see it coming, not one bit." Eleanor smiled back, feeling a sense of satisfaction she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Donna wasn't just a neighbor. She was an ally, someone who understood the kind of strength it took to stand up for yourself, even when everything seemed stacked against. "I'll be right here when it all goes down," Donna added, her voice firm. Eleanor gave her a small nod. "Thank you, Donna. I couldn't have done this without." Donna's smile widened. "You'll do fine. You've got the fire now. You just needed the spark." As Donna turned to leave, Eleanor took one last look at the house, the place that had been her sanctuary, her family's home, and now, someone else's future. She wasn't letting go. She was giving. She picked up the pen, feeling the weight of it in her hand, and without hesitation, she signed the contract. With one smooth motion, everything changed. And as the ink dried, Eleanor felt the finality of it settle in her chest, like the first breath of fresh air after being trapped in a room too long. The house was gone, but she was far from finished. The game was just beginning. The morning sunlight was harsh through the kitchen window, casting sharp angles across the table where the remnants of breakfast sat. Half-drunk cups of coffee, plates still marked with the smudges of buttered toast. The house, quiet now except for the soft clink of Caleb and Heather's voices, felt too small, too still, too normal. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her fingers loosely curled around a coffee mug, the steam rising in thin curls. She hadn't touched her toe. She hadn't touched anything. The warmth of the kitchen was a stark contrast to the cold certainty sitting heavy in her. They were oblivious, laughing between bites, as if nothing had changed. It had been so simple, signing that contract. She had expected the rush of satisfaction, but instead, there was only a strange, hollow space inside her. The house was sold. The house that had been everything. The house that was the last piece of her life before the world cracked apart. Caleb's laughter broke the quiet, too bright, too carefree. "Mom," he chuckled, his voice full of smug warmth, "we're going to knock down your sewing room and make it into a guest bedroom." His grin was wide, the kind he wore when he thought he was making a clever joke. Eleanor didn't answer at first, didn't even flinch. She let the words float past her, like so many others had. She had already said goodbye to that room long ago, when they had packed up the last of her things, when the house no longer held meaning for them, just for her. Heather picked up where Caleb left off, her voice sharp and sweet in equal measure. I've already been picking out colors for the new space. It'll be perfect. Eleanor let the laughter hang in the air, the clinking of plates, the sounds of the world that didn't know what was coming. She took another sip of coffee, letting the warmth roll down her throat. She could hear them talking, more excited than they had been in years. Caleb, talking about the new furniture. Heather, rambling on about curtains and counters. They thought this was it. They thought they were winning. And yet, as Eleanor sat there, the room feeling too small, she smiled faintly. It was a smile they would never understand. Her phone buzzed on the table, just once, cutting through their chatter like an interruption. Caleb didn't notice. Neither did Heather. They were too wrapped up in their plans. But Eleanor saw it, the name on the screen. Donna. She picked it up with a slow hand, her gaze flicking briefly to her son and his wife, who were deep in a discussion about remodeling. Eleanor swiped the message open. It's official. The house is sold. The words hit her with a strange kind of finality, like a door closing behind her. She wasn't sure whether it felt like a weight being lifted or a burden being handed to someone else. But in that moment, everything shifted again. It was done. The deal was sealed. She didn't smile, not outwardly, but inside, something stirred. The house, her sanctuary, was gone. But it had given her something far more important: control. Who's that? Caleb's voice cut through her thoughts, his words still laced with that jovial arrogance. Any new clients? Or are you just playing with your friends again? Eleanor looked up, meeting his gaze for just a second, feeling the familiar pang of frustration rising in her chest. She set her phone down slowly, the weight of it now grounding her. No one important, she replied, her voice flat. Just checking a few things. Donna's text echoed in her mind again, the words growing louder in the silence between them. It's official. The last bit of control she had over this house, over them, was slipping away. But not all at once. No, she would make them feel it. Do you still think that knocking down the sewing room will be the answer? Eleanor asked quietly, her voice calm but edged with something deep. Heather, too busy with her phone, didn't respond right away. But Caleb, eyes bright, laughed again, a little too loudly. It's just a room, Mom. You won't even miss it once we're done. You should be excited for us. We're fixing up the place for the future, not living in the past. Eleanor's smile faltered, but only for a moment. She didn't need them to understand. Not anymore. She knew what they didn't. The future had already left them behind. She stood up from the table, her legs steady, her movements slow, deliberate. She reached for her coffee. One last sip, savoring the warmth, before turning back toward the window. Outside, the world was still bright, still loud, still unaware of what had happened, what was about to happen. As she stared out the window, she caught a glimpse of the moving truck parked on the street. The heavy hum of it seemed to press against the silence in her. She had signed away the house, but it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. They wouldn't see it coming. They couldn't. Not until breakfast. Eleanor stood in the doorway, the weight of the moment heavy on her. Caleb and Heather were still in the kitchen, their voices rising with excitement as they discussed wallpaper and furniture. The sound of their plans was like a dull hum to her ears, a white noise that only underscored how far they had drifted from the life she had once known. The smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of old wood and dust. Her fingers, still warm from the mug, tightened around the doorframe as she took in the quiet. This was it. The final piece of the puzzle. The last tether to a life she was leaving behind. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the room slowly, her shoes tapping against the wooden floor in time with the pulse of her heart. Her eyes flicked to Ruby, who sat at the table, her hands nervously smoothing the fabric of her napkin. She was quiet, watching Eleanor with a mix of concern and something else. Anticipation. Eleanor hesitated for just a second longer, gathering the strength to speak the words that had been building in her chest for so long. When she finally did, her voice was steady, though it felt like a weight lifting with every syllable. I sold the house. There was a split second of silence. Then, the words dropped like stones into water. Caleb's fork clattered onto his plate, and he turned to her with wide, disbelieving eyes. You wouldn't dare. His voice cracked, the arrogance suddenly gone. For a moment, Eleanor almost saw a flicker of panic in his gaze, but it was quickly masked by his forced, practiced calm. Mom, this isn't funny. Heather, who had been quietly sipping her coffee, looked up then. Her expression shifted from one of mild interest to something darker, more dangerous. You can't, she spat. The words like venom. You can't just sell the house without telling us, without asking us. This is our future too. Eleanor stood her ground, the words coming easily now, though her heart beat in her throat. She had been waiting for this moment, for the reaction, for the explosion. It didn't surprise her, not really, but it still stung. I just did, Eleanor said quietly, her gaze unwavering as she met Heather's fiery eyes. Ruby's eyes darted between the three of them, her lips parted, as though she could barely believe what she was hearing. She sat back in her chair, the napkin forgotten in her lap. Then, just as the tension in the air thickened, her lips curled into something like a smile. It wasn't the kind of smile Eleanor had seen on her granddaughter's face before. No, this was something different. A look of pride. Quiet, but unmistakable. I'm proud of you, Grandma, Ruby whispered, almost to herself, but loud enough for Eleanor to hear. The words, simple as they were, hit her like a rush of warmth. Her heart swelled with something fierce and bittersweet. For a moment, the weight of it all felt almost bearable. Ruby's quiet defiance against everything Caleb and Heather stood for. The realization that, at least in this small way, she wasn't alone. Across the fence, Donna's face appeared in the window, the familiar glint of satisfaction in her eyes. She hadn't been able to resist watching the storm from her porch, and now she gave Eleanor a small, knowing smile. Now that's how you do it, Donna mouthed from across the yard, her lips curving up into a grin that spoke volumes. Eleanor's own lips twitched into a smile, the first real one she'd allowed herself in days. Her eyes shifted back to her son and daughter-in-law. Caleb was still staring at her, his face frozen while Heather's hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. You're crazy, Caleb muttered under his breath, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. You've ruined everything. This house, this family. Eleanor's smile faded, replaced by a calm resolve. I didn't ruin anything, she said softly. I gave you the space to do what you wanted. I gave you everything you needed. But now it's my turn. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. The air between them thickened, crackling with the tension of 100 unsaid things. Heather stood suddenly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. I don't understand. You've lost your mind, Eleanor. Her eyes were wild with anger, but beneath that was something. Fear. Fear that she had lost control. How could you do this to us? Eleanor's voice was gentle, but it carried the weight of finality. I did it for me. Ruby stood, her eyes still locked on Eleanor's. Without a word, she walked over, her arms wrapping around her grandmother in a tight hug. The gesture was small, but in that moment, it was everything. It was proof that, despite all of the chaos, Eleanor hadn't been alone not complete. Donna's voice rang in Eleanor's ears again. They won't see it coming. The words had been a quiet warning, but now they felt like a prophecy fulfilled. Caleb and Heather were still reeling, lost in the chaos of their own fury, while Ruby stood with Eleanor, the one person who truly understood. Eleanor felt the last breath of the house, her house, leave her, but it was a relief, not a loss. The game had changed. They hadn't won. Not yet. Not until breakfast, Eleanor murmured to herself, feeling the satisfaction hum in her chest as she watched the storm begin to rage. The real battle was just beginning. The courthouse loomed in the distance, its cold stone facade bathed in the late afternoon light. Eleanor stood at the entrance, the weight of her decision settling over her like a blanket. She had expected this moment, the confrontation, the battle for control. But now that it was here, she was calm. More than calm. There was an almost peaceful finality to it. Caleb and Heather were already inside, seated at the long wooden bench, their backs stiff and their faces drawn. Their eyes kept flicking nervously toward the door, where Eleanor would soon appear. The tension between them crackled, thick and suffocating. Eleanor walked in slowly, her heels clicking against the polished floors. Martin Hale was by her side, as steady and composed as ever. He had been with her every step of the way, and now, with the sale of the house behind her, his quiet confidence was all she needed. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone was enough to remind her that everything was in order. The courtroom was quiet, save for the rustling of papers and the soft shuffle of feet. The judge sat at the far end, his eyes focused on a thick stack of documents. His demeanor was one of quiet authority, the kind that came from years of settling disputes with nothing more than a gavel and a few well-chosen words. Eleanor sat down, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She felt the weight of their eyes on her, the judgment in Caleb's and Heather's gaze, the quiet support from Ruby, who sat beside her, a look of determination on her young face. Donna was in the back, her arms crossed, watching the proceedings with a smug expression on her face, as if she were enjoying the drama of it. The judge cleared his throat, and the room fell into an uneasy silence. "Let's begin," he said, his voice gruff but steady. "Mr. Hale, please present the document." Martin stood, his posture perfect, his gaze unwavering as he approached the judge's bench. He slid the stack of papers across the table with deliberate precision. "Your Honor," he began, "these are the sale documents for the property in question. All transactions have been conducted legally and without error. The deed has been transferred, and the sale is complete." The judge scanned the papers, nodding slowly as he flipped through them. "Everything seems to be in," he muttered under his breath, before lifting his eyes to the room. "This contract is airtight. No mistakes, no loopholes." Eleanor felt a surge of relief, but she didn't let it show. She knew the next part would be harder, the part where Caleb and Heather would fight, where they would try to twist the narrative, to turn the tables on her. Caleb shifted in his seat, his face reddening. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice rising. "She can't just sell the house out from under us. We're her family. You can't just take everything and leave us with nothing." The judge raised a hand, his expression stern. "Mr. Briggs, please. This is a court of law, not a place for emotional outbursts." Caleb clenched his jaw, his fists tightening on the table. "She sold everything without even asking. She didn't even give us a chance." His voice cracked at the end, the frustration and helplessness pouring out in a single angry breath. Heather, sitting beside him, crossed her arms over her chest, her lips tight with disdain. "You can't just take everything she has. You can't do this to us." Eleanor felt the anger in Heather's voice, but it no longer had the sting it once did. She had made her choice, and nothing, no one, could take that from her. "Your Honor," Martin said, his voice steady, cutting through the rising tension in the room. "We have clear documentation that the sale was legal. There is no dispute. The house was sold, as per Mrs. Briggs's wishes." The judge nodded again, his gaze flicking between the two sides. "Very well. But there is a claim of misconduct here. Mr. Briggs, would you care to elaborate?" Caleb's anger seemed to boil over. "She sold all of her things, the clothes, the personal items, without consulting us. How is that right?" Eleanor's heart tightened, but she didn't flinch. This wasn't about the things anymore. This was about respect, about dignity, about taking control of her own life for the first time in years. Ruby stood then, her small frame trembling slightly with nervous energy, but her voice was clear and firm. "They sold her things without asking. They didn't even give her a choice." Eleanor's gaze softened as she looked at her granddaughter, her heart swelling with pride. Ruby had been there, quietly watching, silently supporting her. It was because of Ruby that Eleanor had found the strength to act. And now, Ruby was speaking up, her words carrying the weight of everything Eleanor had hoped for. The judge turned toward Ruby, his brow raised in mild surprise. "And you are—" "I'm her granddaughter," Ruby replied, her voice steady despite the obvious tension. "And I saw how they treated her, how they didn't respect her. She didn't deserve that." Donna, still sitting in the gallery, let out a soft, almost imperceptible chuckle. Her arms were still crossed, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the way she leaned back, as though watching a show she knew would end in her favor. The judge glanced at the documents again, his fingers tapping the paper thoughtfully. "Well, it seems we have quite a bit of family drama here, but the law is clear. Mrs. Briggs has every right to sell the property, and the sale is legally binding." Caleb's face twisted with frustration, but it was Heather's face that was the most telling. Her cheeks were flushed with her lips pressed into a tight line. "This isn't over," she spat, her words cold and venomous. Eleanor didn't respond. She didn't need to. The game was already won. The judge slammed his gavel down, signaling the end of the hearing. "This case is dismissed. The sale stands. Mrs. Briggs, your property is legally sold. I suggest you all find a way to move forward." As the courtroom emptied, Eleanor stood, her back straight, her chin lifted. Ruby stayed close, her hand slipping into Eleanor's for a moment, offering silent support. Donna's smile from across the room was almost knowing, but Eleanor didn't let it distract her. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was in control. The sun was high, casting the neighborhood in harsh afternoon light, but Eleanor remained on her porch, her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding below. She had made her choice, and now she would watch them face the consequences. The moving trucks pulled into the driveway with the same hum of inevitability that had followed her since the day she signed those papers. The engines cut off, the sound of rolling doors opening followed by the clatter of boxes hitting the ground. The process had begun. She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply watched. The creaking of the porch rocker the only sound she made as she rocked slowly back and forth. The quiet was a comfort, a soothing balm for the chaos that had once filled this place. From the corner of her eye, she saw Caleb emerge from the house. His face was twisted in fury, his jaw clenched so tightly she could almost hear the grind of his. He was trying to control the situation, to assert some kind of power, but it was all slipping through his fingers. He walked towards the moving truck, gesturing angrily at the men unloading boxes. "Be careful with that," he snapped, his voice raised. "Those are our things. Take care of them." Heather stood beside him, her face streaked with tears. She was sobbing openly now, her hands pressed to her cheeks as if the very sight of the truck had shattered her. She looked small, fragile, and utterly broken, the tears streaming down her face only adding to the weight of the moment. Eleanor felt no sympathy, no guilt. This was the price of their greed, their arrogance. She had given them everything they wanted, and they had never once considered what she needed, what she deserved. Ruby stood by the door, her phone in her hand, discreetly filming the scene unfolding. Eleanor didn't say anything, didn't need to. Ruby was silent too, her face focused, her expression hardening with every frame she captured. Eleanor's eyes lingered on Ruby for a moment. She was growing up before her eyes, becoming more than just the granddaughter who had quietly. Ruby was strong, strong in ways Eleanor hadn't expected, and it made her heart swell with pride. There was hope in Ruby, something pure, something that couldn't be bought or. The sound of Heather's sobs rose higher, her voice breaking as she stood by the truck, hands on her hips. "This isn't fair," she cried, her voice shaking. "We're losing everything. This was supposed to be our home." Caleb's anger flared up again, a spark of rage he couldn't quite control. He slammed his fist onto the side of the truck, his knuckles white with fury. "You did this, Mom!" he yelled, the words reverberating through the empty street. "You took everything from us!" Eleanor remained unmoved. She didn't flinch at his words, didn't rise to meet his challenge. She simply sat there, watching them. The house wasn't their home anymore. They had stripped it of its meaning long ago. And now, it was hers to give away. to sell, to let go. Donna's voice cut through the tense silence. She was standing at the edge of the yard now, leaning casually against the fence with a knowing smile on her face. "Looks lighter already," she said, her tone low, her eyes glinting with quiet satisfaction. Eleanor glanced at her neighbor and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The house did look lighter, lighter without the weight of their presence in it, lighter without the tension and the selfishness that had filled its walls. It was a new beginning, for her and for the house. "Rot doesn't get to stay," Eleanor murmured under her breath, the words soft but resolute. She wasn't just talking about the house. Not really. She was talking about Caleb, Heather, and everything they had taken from her. This wasn't just about selling a house. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen from her, piece by piece, for years. Ruby looked up from her phone and caught her grandmother's gaze. There was no need for words. Ruby knew exactly what Eleanor meant. They didn't have to say it out loud. It was understood. As the movers continued unloading the last of their belongings, Caleb's anger seemed to ebb slightly, but his resentment remained, simmering just beneath the surface. He was trying to piece together the remnants of a life that had once been, but it wasn't his anymore. He wouldn't get that life back. Not like this. Eleanor rocked slowly in her chair, the rhythmic creak of the wood soothing her, her gaze fixed on the scene. Caleb and Heather would have to find their own way forward now, just as she had. The house had given her a place to fight, to resist, to stand her ground. But now, it was gone. And so were they. And yet, she felt no sorrow, no regret. The storm had passed, and Eleanor Briggs, finally, had won. The air was thick with the sounds of movement, boxes being loaded, items clattering, doors slamming. But through it all, Ruby stood quietly, her phone in hand, focused on the scene unfolding before her. Eleanor knew exactly what Ruby was doing. Her granddaughter was documenting everything, capturing the raw chaos of this moment, the drama that had played out so perfectly, so painfully. The phone's camera clicked softly, and Ruby's eyes never left the screen. She was watching, recording, but there was something more behind her action. Eleanor could feel it. Ruby wasn't just filming for the sake of capturing the moment. She was preparing a record, a story that would live beyond today. Eleanor's gaze swept over the scene below. Heather, still sobbing uncontrollably, had planted herself in the middle of the front yard, refusing to leave. Caleb, pacing like a trapped animal, his face twisted with rage, barked at anyone who came too close, his fury a visible storm. The moving truck sat idle, packed with their things, but still, Heather wouldn't move, wouldn't accept that it was over. Eleanor watched quietly, a small, satisfied smile curling on her lips. This was it. Their last act of defiance. They couldn't walk away. Not yet. Not until they had been utterly defeated. Ruby's fingers moved quickly over her phone screen, and Eleanor knew what was coming next. She had no idea whether it would make things worse for Caleb and Heather, or whether it would stir up even more resentment. But she wasn't concerned about that anymore. The world would see. And the world would know. The phone beeped softly. The clip was posted. Ruby hadn't said a word, but Eleanor caught the slight glance she threw her way. A question. A confirmation. Eleanor nodded as if to say, "It's time." The video hit the internet. The clip of Heather crying out in protest. Caleb screaming about how she had ruined them. The caption was simple: "When greed and entitlement destroy everything." It didn't take long for the floodgates to. The clip exploded online, shared 100 times over, picked up by neighbors who had been quietly watching, the ones who had always whispered about Eleanor's family, but never truly understood what had been happening behind closed doors. Thousands of likes, comments, and shares rolled in. The video was everywhere now, and with every share, Eleanor's quiet victory spread further. There was something poetic about it. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about exposure, about showing the world what they had done to her, and now, finally, letting it all be seen. The truth, raw and unfiltered. Across the street, Eleanor could hear the neighbors gathering on their porches, whispering loudly enough for anyone to hear, laughing, gossiping about the drama. "I knew they were trouble," one voice called out. "I always said they'd turn on her," another chimed in. The whispers grew louder, like a chorus of approval. No one had spoken out before, not in such an open way. But now, the video had changed everything. People were talking. Through the noise, Eleanor could hear Heather's sobs growing louder, her body heaving as she stood her ground in front of the truck, refusing to move. The last of her belongings were being loaded up, but she refused to acknowledge the finality of it all. She wasn't leaving. She couldn't. Caleb stormed over, his face red with fury, his eyes wild. "She ruined us!" he screamed, the words tearing through the air like a knife. "She took everything. You think you've won? You haven't. You're just making it worse for all of us." Eleanor's heart didn't race. It didn't even skip. It was steady. Calm. "No," she thought, watching him with quiet satisfaction. "I'm making it better for me." Ruby kept filming, capturing Caleb's meltdown in its full, unfiltered rage. She was careful, almost protective of the way she filmed, making sure to capture the truth of the moment without adding any commentary of her own. Her eyes were sharp, but her movements slow and steady. She knew how to tell a story, and this one was going to be shared, broadcasted to the world. Caleb and Heather's humiliation was now an event for everyone to witness. Eleanor leaned back in her rocker, her gaze still steady as she watched the spectacle. The wind picked, rustling the leaves of the old oak tree. The world was still, but it was moving forward. As the final boxes were loaded onto the truck, Caleb and Heather continued their performance, their anger and sorrow like an act they could not drop. Heather, still standing in the middle of the yard, her hands wringing, unable to face the truth that had been given to her. Caleb, pacing in circles, unable to reconcile the reality of the situation. Ruby stood next to Eleanor now, her phone lowered, a quiet victory in her eyes. Eleanor's gaze softened. "It's done, sweetheart." Ruby nodded, her face still intent. She had seen it all. But the pride in her eyes? That was unmistakable. Ruby had watched her grandmother rise up from the ashes, and now, the world would see too. Eleanor's smile was small, but it was full of something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. The house was gone, but they had been the ones who had lost everything. It was their loss, not hers. As Heather finally broke down into uncontrollable sobs, collapsing onto the front porch steps, Eleanor's words echoed softly. "Rot doesn't get to stay." She let out a long breath, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of it all lift. The world had seen, and the storm, it seemed, had passed. The morning sun spilled through the kitchen window, casting its warm glow over the quiet room. Eleanor sat at the table, her fingers tracing the edge of a check, a portion of the proceeds from the sale of the house. It was substantial, more than she had ever imagined. But it wasn't the money that mattered. It was what she would do with it. The house was gone. The battle had been won, but Eleanor's mind wasn't on what she had lost. She'd given up the past, yes, but now she had the chance to shape something that would outlast them all. Ruby sat next to her, still with that quiet strength she had shown throughout it all. Her eyes were soft, but there was a fire behind them. "Grandma, what are you going to do with all this?" she asked, her voice full of curiosity and admiration. Eleanor smiled, her heart swelling at the thought. "I'm giving it to something that matters," she said, her voice steady. She reached for a letter on the table, the one that had been sitting there for a week, unopened. It was from the women's housing nonprofit she had connected with, a place that offered safety and support to women who had nowhere else to. The nonprofit had sent a proposal for their new building fund, and Eleanor knew, deep down, that this was the place where the money should go. She stood and walked to the drawer, pulling out a piece of paper and a pen. "I'm going to name it after my career," she said, glancing over at Ruby with a faint smile. "Stitch and Shelter. It's what I've done all my life. Sewing, stitching things together. And now I'm going to help stitch together the lives of women who need a home." Ruby's eyes widened and she reached out, her voice thick with emotion. "You're amazing, Grandma," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. Eleanor's hand stilled as she looked at Ruby, her heart full. "It's not about me," she said gently, her voice carrying a quiet, resolute strength. "It's about them. About giving them the chance I never had. To rebuild their lives, just like I rebuilt mine." Outside, through the window, Eleanor could see Donna walking down the sidewalk, her usual brisk pace a little slower today. Donna always seemed to know when something significant was happening. She had been Eleanor's ally, her friend, through it all, watching her stand tall, even when the world was trying to knock her down. Donna stopped by the gate and waved, her expression softened, almost reverent. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch to meet her, the light from the sun casting long shadows across the yard. Donna's eyes glistened as she looked at Eleanor, her voice rough with emotion. "That'll outlast them, you know," she said, her tone filled with quiet pride. "What you're doing, it's going to leave a mark. A real one." Eleanor nodded, her chest tightening at the weight of Donna's words. She had spent so many years feeling invisible, discarded. But now, it was different. She was creating something that couldn't be ignored. Martin Hale appeared at the gate then, his briefcase in his usual calm demeanor unchanged. "Eleanor," he greeted her with a small nod, his voice carrying the sense of finality that always accompanied his presence. "I've filed the trust paperwork. The fund is set up. You're ready." Eleanor turned toward him, her gaze steady. "Thank you, Martin," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. He had been more than just a lawyer. He had been her partner in this, ensuring everything was legal, that everything would last beyond this moment. He smiled faintly. "It's my pleasure. It's rare that I see someone with such determination. You've done something remarkable here." Eleanor's smile was small but proud. "The world doesn't always get to see the quiet one," she said, her voice tinged with both bitterness and hope. "But when it does, they remember." The wind shifted slightly, brushing the leaves in the trees, carrying with it a sense of closure. Eleanor stood tall, the weight of the past lifting off her shoulders. The future was wide open now, ready to be filled with something meaningful. Ruby stood beside her, hand resting lightly on her grandmother's arm. Donna stood by the gate, her arms crossed, watching with a knowing smile. And Martin stood with them, a silent witness to the transformation that had unfolded in this small corner of the world. Eleanor took a deep breath, the sunlight warm on her face. "Greed fades," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "Roots stay." The world had seen her strength, her resilience, and now she would build something that would last. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the porch, Eleanor smiled softly, the quiet satisfaction of a battle well fought settling deep within her bones. This was only the beginning. The afternoon was thick with the quiet hum of life moving on, but in the air around Eleanor, there was a stillness, a strange pause before something inevitable. It had been days since the house had been cleared, and the echoes of Caleb and Heather's furious outbursts had faded into nothingness. Eleanor had been waiting for something, though she hadn't known exactly what. Something to shift, something that would show her whether her decision had been the right one. Then, one morning, Caleb appeared at her door. He stood on the porch, a shadow of the man who had once been so sure, so demanding. His posture was slumped, his eyes shadowed with something Eleanor couldn't quite read. The arrogance, the entitlement, it was gone, replaced by something smaller, something fragile. For a moment, Eleanor didn't move, didn't even acknowledge him. She was sure he could feel the weight of the silence pressing down, thick and suffocating. But she wasn't going to make it easy for him, not anymore. Finally, Caleb shifted, rubbing the back of his neck in a gesture of "Mom, we need to talk." Eleanor didn't respond right away. She let the silence stretch between them, testing him, watching him. There were so many words she could have thrown at him in that moment, so many accusations, so many things to say. But instead, she simply raised an eyebrow, waiting. I've been thinking," he began, his voice tight. "I know I screwed up. I was wrong about everything." Eleanor's lips pressed together. She had been waiting for this apology. but the bitterness that rose in her chest stopped her from feeling any satisfaction. The words tasted hollow. There had been years of this, years of his disregard for her, for the life they had once shared in that house. The apology now felt like a last-ditch effort to salvage something that was already lost. "You've been thinking?" Eleanor's voice was low, measured, each word deliberately slow. "What about the times you laughed when I asked for help? What about the things you said when I tried to hold on to what mattered to me?" Caleb's face flushed, and his eyes flicked to the ground. "I know," he muttered, his voice thick with shame. I I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. I didn't see it until it was too late. But I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. Can we start over?" Eleanor's gaze softened, but only for a brief moment. She couldn't forgive him for this. She couldn't forgive him for the years of disrespect. The words didn't come easily. "You didn't laugh when my dress was worth $1, did you?" Eleanor said softly, her eyes meeting his, piercing and steady. "When you sold everything I ever made, it wasn't funny then, was it?" Ruby, who had been watching from the open door behind Eleanor, lifted her phone just slightly, discreetly recording the moment. She didn't say a word, but Eleanor could feel her presence, the quiet support, the unwavering faith Ruby had shown her throughout everything. Caleb's jaw tightened as he struggled to meet his mother's gaze. The tension in the air grew thicker. "Mom, please, I was an idiot. I didn't understand. Stop," Eleanor interrupted, her voice a calm force that stopped him in his tracks. "You didn't understand? That's what you think?" "No, Caleb. You didn't care." Her eyes narrowed as she leaned forward, a quiet steel in her voice. "You cared about you. About getting what you wanted. You used me for your own benefit." He didn't have a response for that, and for a long moment he was silent. Finally, he seemed to sag, his face contorting with something close to desperation. "I'm sorry, okay?" he said again, his voice rising with a hint of panic. "I know I screwed up. Just, just don't leave it like this. We're family, Mom." At that, Eleanor's resolve hardened. She had spent so many years trying to be the good mother, the good wife, the good woman. She had spent too much of her life bending to their demands. But no more. "You're right," she said, her tone flat and final. "We are family. But family isn't just about blood. It's about respect. And you lost that, Caleb. You lost my respect a long time ago." He didn't say anything after that, standing still as the weight of her words settled around him. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His apology was empty, a hollow shell. Eleanor had known it wouldn't be enough. She had been expecting this, but now that it was here, the bitterness of it tasted like ash in her mouth. In the distance, from the far end of the yard, Donna watched with her arms crossed, her lips curling into a smirk. "He wants pity," she scoffed to herself, "not forgiveness." Eleanor turned to Donna, meeting her eyes with a small nod of acknowledgement. Then, she looked back at Caleb, her gaze unwavering. "I'm done here," she said quietly, turning on her heel. "You should be too." Caleb stood frozen for a moment longer, his face a mask of frustration and shame. He had tried, but Eleanor knew that some things couldn't be fixed with a few words. Ruby followed Eleanor back into the house, the camera still in her hand, but the phone now turned off. Eleanor didn't need Ruby to say anything. They both knew. The door clicked shut behind them, and the house was once again quiet. Eleanor exhaled deeply, letting go of the last remnants of her past, and for the first time in years, she felt the weight of the world shift. Just a little. The small office was quiet except for the faint scratch of a pen on. Eleanor sat across from Martin Hale, the cool, precise lines of his handwriting a steady contrast to the weight of her thoughts. It was time. She had already given away so much of herself, but this final act was one she knew would define everything going forward. Ruby sat beside her, her fingers tapping lightly on her knee, the air between them charged with unspoken understanding. The house was gone, the past was finished. This was the future, and it had to be sealed, legally and irrevocably. Eleanor glanced at the pages Martin had laid out before her. The will was straightforward, but there was one part that mattered more than the rest. the one part she had spent days, weeks even, contemplating, the legacy she was leaving behind. Ruby, Eleanor began softly, her voice steady as she turned to her granddaughter. Ruby met her gaze, her eyes wide but unwavering. I'm leaving you everything, Eleanor said, her hand gently resting on the. You'll be my sole heir, but only once you finish college or trade school. Ruby blinked, the shock in her expression quickly replaced by something more profound: determination. I understand, Grandma, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I'll make you proud. Eleanor smiled faintly, her heart swelling with pride. Ruby had always been the one who understood. She didn't need to be told to honor the past. Ruby had always been a part of it in the most meaningful way, and now she would carry it forward. There was a second part to the will, one that had taken Eleanor a long time to finalize. The remainder of her estate, everything left over after Ruby had her, would go to Stitch and Shelter, the fund she had set up for the women's housing nonprofit. She looked at Martin, who was waiting for her to sign. His eyes were calm, businesslike, but there was a quiet respect there. This is the part that matters, Eleanor said, her voice resolute. This is where everything I've done can still make a difference. Martin nodded, his expression one of quiet approval. It's all in order, Eleanor, he said, setting the documents down in front of her. I've made sure of it. Everything's ironclad. Eleanor picked up the pen, her fingers steady, and signed the last page of the will. She could almost feel the weight of her choices lifting from her shoulders. This was the final step. It was done. The future was now in motion. Ruby would be taken care of. The fund would be established in her name, and women who needed a home, a fresh start, would benefit from everything she had built. The room seemed to shift slightly as she put the pen down, a sense of finality settling over the space like a cloak. It was done. She glanced over at Donna, who had entered quietly during the process, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, a small, knowing smile on her face. Ironclad, Donna said, her voice dripping with approval. I knew you'd do it right. Eleanor exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. The relief was immediate, almost physical, as if a weight had been lifted from her chest. She had done what she set out to do, and now it would all unfold. The house was gone, but what she had left behind would matter more. She had fought for her freedom, and now she was leaving behind something that would carry her legacy further than any brick or wood could. Martin stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor. He gathered the papers and slid them into an envelope, handing it to Eleanor. It's official now. I'll file this for you. Your wishes will be upheld. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. Thank you, Martin, for everything. Ruby stood too, her gaze soft with gratitude and something else, something more profound. Eleanor could see the weight of it in her granddaughter's eyes. Ruby wasn't just inheriting a house or money, she was inheriting the strength to stand on her own, to carry forward the lessons that had been passed down through years of struggle and resilience. Donna gave a small chuckle, a mischievous glint in her eye. You know, she said, her voice light but I always thought you were too quiet. But now I see. You've been planning this for years. Eleanor's smile was small, but it carried more satisfaction than any victory she had ever known. Sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous, she said softly, her eyes meeting Ruby's. They don't forget. Donna shook her head, clearly impressed. Well, I'll say one thing for you, Eleanor Briggs. You've made your mark, and it'll last. Eleanor felt the weight of those words, the truth of them, settle deep within her. She had made her mark. The world had seen her strength, her determination, and now the world would see the legacy she left behind. She rose from the chair, slowly, the quiet finality of it all settling in. The world felt different now, lighter somehow, and for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt as though she was finally at peace. Greed fades, she murmured almost to herself. But roots stay. She turned toward the window, watching as the light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. And in that moment, she knew, with a certainty that filled her soul, that what she had done would outlast everything. And as she watched the light dance on the leaves, Eleanor knew that, finally, everything would be okay. The soft click of the door closing behind Ruby broke the stillness of the room. Eleanor had just finished reading through the final version of her will for the last time. She felt the relief that always came with a task completed. But today, it was different. Today, there was a sense of finality that filled her lungs with more peace than she had ever known. She turned toward the doorway, and Ruby stood there, holding something large, folded carefully in her arms. It was a quilt. A simple one, but Eleanor could already feel the weight of its meaning. "Grandma," Ruby said softly, stepping into the room and unfolding the quilt onto the table between. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she looked down at it. Each square was made from fabric she recognized, scraps of old clothes, tattered but lovingly pieced together. There was the pale blue fabric from the dress she had worn to her last anniversary with Harry, the patterned red square from a shirt Caleb used to wear as a child, and a patch of floral fabric from one of her old sewing aprons. Her fingers hovered over the squares, each one holding a memory, a piece of her life stitched into its very threads. There was something about it that made the room feel warmer, as if every memory she had ever carried had been woven into this creation. "Ruby." Eleanor's voice trembled slightly, her eyes welling with tears. "You made this for me?" Ruby nodded, her face serious, yet soft. "Each square tells a story. Every piece of fabric is something that meant something, something you've worked for, something you've loved." Her voice caught, but she pushed through, her gaze steady. "Your story isn't just in the house, Grandma. It's in everything you've made, everything you've done. It's stitched into you." Eleanor swallowed, trying to steady her emotions, but they threatened to spill over anyway. She didn't know what to say. The quilt was so simple, yet so much more than anything she had ever expected from. In that moment, the weight of everything she had lost and everything she had gained rushed forward like a tidal wave. Donna, who had stepped into the room silently, watched the exchange with her usual sharp eyes. Her arms were crossed, but there was something different in her, a softness, a rare vulnerability. "Better than any inheritance," Donna muttered, her voice low, almost reverent, as she nodded toward the quilt. "This right here. Eleanor, it's everything." Eleanor could only nod, her hand resting gently on the quilt's edge. "It's more than I could have asked for," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. She looked at Ruby, her chest tight with emotion. "You've given me something that will outlast anything I've built. This, this is my real legacy." Ruby gave her a small, almost shy smile, her fingers smoothing out one of the edges. "Your story won't be sold, Grandma. It won't be thrown away. Not by me. Not by anyone." Her voice was fierce with the promise, as if staking a claim on something too precious to. Eleanor's heart swelled as she looked at her granddaughter. The words were so simple, but the meaning behind them was everything. Ruby had always been the one to understand, the one who never doubted her. And now, here she was, giving her this quilt, her story, in the fabric of 1,000 moments. "It's stitched into me," Eleanor murmured, her hand gently running over the fabric, feeling the memories pulse under her fingers. She felt them all, each piece, each stitch, each part of the life she had lived and the woman she had. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the tears come. They weren't just for the years that had been taken or for the house she'd lost. They were for Ruby, for the quilt, for the life she had lived, and the love that still wrapped around her like a warm embrace. Donna stepped forward, her usual brashness softened by the weight of the moment. "You did it, Eleanor. You turned all that mess into something beautiful, not just for you, but for her too." Eleanor nodded, her hand resting on Ruby's shoulder. "I didn't do it alone," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Not anymore." They all stood there, in the quiet room, the quilt between them a testament to the bond they shared, the kind that wasn't built from bricks and walls, but from the quiet strength of love, memory, and resilience. And as Eleanor stood there looking at Ruby, at Donna, she realized that, for the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was finally living. And that was a legacy worth leaving behind. The weight of the world seemed to lift just a little more as Eleanor smiled through her tears. This was her story, her gift, and no one could take it, not ever again. The morning sunlight slanted through the trees, casting long shadows on the freshly paved path that led to the new women's housing complex. Eleanor stood at the edge of the property, her eyes scanning the rows of buildings that now housed something more than just bricks and this was her legacy, the real one, and it had a pulse of its own. Ruby stood beside her, her hand lightly brushing Eleanor's arm, her face beaming with pride. They had come here together, to witness the first of the women moving into their new homes, safe, secure, with the promise of a fresh start. The Stitch and Shelter Fund had already made its mark. This place, this haven for women, was a testament to everything Eleanor had fought for. The women came in slowly, carrying the few possessions they had: duffel bags, worn-out suitcases, blankets that had seen too many nights of fear and uncertainty. But today, their faces weren't filled with dread. They were filled with something new: hope. One woman, tall and with her hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, walked slowly toward the door of her apartment, a small smile playing at her lips. Eleanor watched her, her heart swelling. This was why she had done it. This was why she had given everything up. As the door closed behind the last of the women, Ruby turned to Eleanor, her eyes sparkling. "You did it, Grandma. You really did it. You changed everything." Eleanor smiled, but her eyes were distant. She had never expected any kind of fanfare, any praise. She'd done it because it was the right thing to do. But hearing Ruby say it, seeing the pride in her granddaughter's face, made it all worth it. "Not just me, sweetheart," Eleanor said quietly, glancing at Ruby. "You're the reason I kept going. You, and that quilt." Ruby blushed, her fingers running over the hem of her shirt. "I'm just glad you didn't give up. You've given these women a chance. Just like you gave me a chance." Eleanor's smile deepened, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet satisfaction that ran deeper than anything she could explain. They turned back toward the building where Donna was standing, arms crossed, watching the women settle in. She was leaning against a lamppost, that familiar, knowing look on her. "Well, that's real revenge," Donna said, her voice rough but full of admiration. "They sold your clothes at a yard sale while you slept. And now, you've sold the house while they ate breakfast." Eleanor nodded, the weight of Donna's words settling over her like a quiet cloak. This was what she had fought for. Not the house, not the things. They had been just the backdrop. It had always been about what mattered most: the people who needed the space, the safety, the chance to rebuild. Martin Hale, who had been standing at the edge of the property, approached them now, his usual calm demeanor unshaken. He looked over at Eleanor and smiled, his gaze filled with quiet pride. "They can't touch this, Eleanor," he said, gesturing toward the complex. "You've built something that will last, something real." Eleanor exhaled a long, steady breath, watching as the women moved into their home. "They can't touch this," she thought. No one could take this from her. Not Caleb, not Heather. "No," Eleanor said softly, looking at Martin, her voice steady. "They can't." She turned to Ruby, who was standing by her side, still beaming. "The house gave me peace," Eleanor murmured, her gaze softening. "Now it gives others safety." Ruby nodded, her hand slipping into Eleanor. "It's perfect, Grandma. Just perfect." As the day wound down and the last of the women settled into their new home, Eleanor and Ruby made their way back to the car. The drive home was quiet, save for the soft rustle of the wind through. When they arrived back at the house, Eleanor paused on the porch, the weight of everything finally settling in. She sat down in the rocking chair, feeling the cool evening air wrap around her. Ruby joined her, slipping into the chair beside her, both of them content in the stillness of the moment. Eleanor leaned back, the old wood creaking beneath her. She took a deep breath, the smell of fresh earth and new beginnings filling her lungs. It had been a long road, but it had led her here, and for the first time, the world felt at peace. With a small smile, Eleanor picked up her glass of sweet tea, her fingers gently tapping against the cool glass. She turned to Ruby, her voice soft but certain. They sold my clothes at a yard sale while I slept, Eleanor said, her smile widening slightly. So I sold the house while they ate breakfast. Ruby laughed softly, her fingers tightening around her grandmother's head. And now you've built something that will never be sold. Eleanor smiled, content. No one will ever sell this. And as the sun sank behind the horizon, casting the yard in golden light, Eleanor knew, deep in her heart, that she had won. The house might have been sold, but this new beginning, it would last forever. Her legacy was secure, and it was only just beginning.